Welcome back to our Becoming a Microsoft Azure Administrator seminar series here at Pluralsight. This is session 4 of 6 and it deals with Azure DevOps. Let me start my timer. I'm going to present for 55 minutes this time around, and then it's time to entertain your questions. So definitely load me up with your questions, comments, concerns, etc. What are we going to cover over the next 55 minutes? First, clarifying a little bit about what that term DevOps means. Remember that the theme of this seminar series is either you want to become an Azure administrator or you are and you want to do career development on top of that. And we're just approaching that subject from a slightly different angle on each of these 6 sessions. We're going to examine Azure DevOps in some detail. I'll do a pretty extended demo in there just to give you some general familiarity, again, through the lens of not the developer, but the Azure administrator. And then we'll consider of the Azure administrator job role in an Azure DevOps organization. So here is our blueprint for the entire seminar series. If you haven't started from the beginning, we began with a general session called Shifting Your Paradigm, where my big thesis was that going from a local data center operator or an on-premises systems administrator into a public cloud like Azure requires that you really shift your whole viewpoint of how to do systems administration. And quick examples I had given are looking at, say, the TCP/IP topology that you've got in your local environment. Maybe you haven't been at your employer long enough to where you didn't have any say in how your topology was even laid out. When it comes to Azure, it's a green field of opportunity, isn't it? You can do over and fix past mistakes and make sure that you're designing with all the good stuff in mind: high availability, security, performance, these sort of things. In sessions 2 and 3, those were dealing with infrastructure as a service, virtual machines largely, and platform as a service, which is hosted virtual machines. Well, it's all hosted, but it all depends on that split line between Microsoft, what they're doing and hosting for you, versus what you need to do as a customer. We're doing DevOps today, of course, and then the last 2 sessions are bookend sessions that drill more wholly into skills development. So the first session sets the stage. The next 3 really get into the meat and potatoes of the job role. And then the last 2 is our landing strip, but also a flight path for you to continue on, whether it's Azure certification, obtaining a role as an Azure administrator, transitioning, whatever the case might be. Session materials, as always, are in one of my GitHub repositories. timw.info/admin is the short URL. And what you can find there, let me get hold of my mouse pointer, are a few things. Let me see here. Go to GitHub, Timothy Warner /admin. Here we go. Of all sessions, I normally say at this point, you don't have to have a GitHub account and you don't have to know anything about Git version control to get to my files. And that's true, but today kind of does presume a little of that, or at least that you're interested in learning how. We've got this green clone or download button here where you can hit download zip to just pull all the files down directly as a single archive, or keeping with things like Git flow or the GitHub flow, you can fork the repository into your GitHub account and you can clone it down to your system. You can make modifications, additions, subtractions, and you can push those changes up to your fork in your own GitHub account. And then if you really want to, I'm open to pull requests, which is where you can recommend or ask, I guess, me to merge your changes into this master copy of the repository. Yeah, so that's definitely in scope for today. But specifically in that repository for each session, there's a PDF representation of the slide deck. There is a Azure reference diagram in Microsoft Visio format. There are links lists for each session, things that come up during the session, I think afterwards, and try to distill those into some hyperlinks, and I'll throw them into a markdown file for you. All right, that's what we got going on. So I created the session title as a nod to a person named Donovan Brown who works for Microsoft. There's a short link to his profile page. And the subject for today, to repeat it for the 5th time or so, is DevOps. So first I figured we would level set and just get a general gentle understanding of what DevOps means in general, and then we'll dive into detail in how DevOps is supported in the Azure ecosystem. All right, so first we've got, and you notice that I've got attribution URIs in the lower left corner of each slide. First, we've got Microsoft's official definition, and I think Donovan Brown is the origin of this quote, as a matter of fact. DevOps is the union of people, process, and products to enable continuous delivery of value to your end users. I often say if you ask 5 IT professionals to define DevOps, you'll probably get 6 or 7 definitions. There's not, to my knowledge, an official, globally agreed upon standard, which is part of the issue with it, actually. But if we look at this statement, this definition, I just really like how it distills a lot of stuff, because I know when I first started examining DevOps, I got hung up initially on just the tools and the idea of a build and release pipeline and wondering, what is that? Then I got hung up on the cultural aspect, the fact, how do you get developers out of their silo, administrators out of their silo, and get them working together? Because after all, their chances are they're supporting the same applications, services, and products. Get them together working collaboratively with the ultimate goal of adding value to the end users who are consuming your apps, whether those are internal line of business applications or customer-facing products. It's the same thing. But I like the fact that it's really a union of all of that stuff. There's people, obviously, and human nature and all the soft skills and communications. There's processes, which we'll talk about in the next slide. And then, of course, there are the products and the tools. But they're really interdependent, I think, is the point. The general personas in DevOps tend to be, of course, the application developers or the coders or the programmers who are building the apps themselves. Then there's the operations folks, the systems administrators, those who are responsible for the infrastructure that those applications will run on. Q&A, we certainly can't leave those people out, because how are we going to deliver maximum value to our customers if we're not QAing our product and getting notified of any defects, fixing them as quickly as humanly possible, or if not humanly possible, we've got automation to do it. And then, of course, there's security. Your business is probably subject to n number of regulations and compliance certifications, and you have to document everything and pass your audits, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. These people need to know how your application, your software development life cycle works. So they're absolutely a persona in this DevOps methodology. If you look into the DevOps literature, I'm going to give you a little bibliography in just a moment. What I think are the canonical or reference texts to learn about DevOps fundamentals is they talk about the 3 ways. I messed up the animation on this slide clearly, but I'll just bring it in a piece at a time. The first way is called system thinking, or you could look at it as flow. And basically this boils down to at least this is my interpretation, my understanding. I bet you $1,000 Don Jones, if he's watching, is probably like, nope. No, but flow means that you've got orchestration and automation to get rid of or reduce, eliminate human error as much as humanly possible. And you've got a setup, pipeline, to use that term, to take care of when a developer checks in a code change into your code base. You've got automation in place to do various types of testing to make sure that that code change works and plays nicely with the other aspects of your application. And the application can get built automatically and deployed to staging locations. Just that whole concept of flow, instead of, in a traditional waterfall type project where you can't start this step until the previous one's finished, but then you're waiting on people and forgetting, and oh, this email dropped out of my inbox, and did you Slack me on that? Or, no, flow is building automation wherever possible to make this process more foolproof or human-proof. Second way, amplify feedback loops. This deals with fail fast, fix fast. So again, to come back to that example of a developer doing a bug fix and committing a code change into the master branch of the repository, the code base. If there is some automated testing and realize that in integration, oh, that this change actually negatively affects this other component, the build should fail immediately. And the stakeholders, certainly the developer, but other stakeholders should also be alerted instantaneously. So again, with the idea is that you can capture these bugs before the customer sees them. So that is definitely central. And then the third way is the culture piece, continual experimentation and learning. And like I said, that's that whole concept of where developers learn a bit about how IT operations and infrastructure works. In the Azure context, those conversations might be centered around Azure Resource Manager templates, PowerShell automation, and that means operations, security, QA are learning more about development than they probably ever thought. Maybe they might think, well, I didn't sign up for this. It's like, well, welcome to 21st century IT. Even though you're not a C# programmer, you're getting pretty good with PowerShell, and you've been working with these Azure Resource Manager templates to make our application more reliable and resilient, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Store all of those artifacts in the same code base as the rest of the application, and let's all work from that same Git point of view, you see? So that's a bit of nutshell logic about the three ways of DevOps. As far as the bibliography that I mentioned, the two canonical books written by some of the same people, Gene Kim in particular, the DevOps Handbook and the Phoenix Project. In retrospect, I read the Phoenix Project first and then read DevOps. I would probably recommend you do the DevOps Handbook first, and then the Phoenix Project will probably light up more intuitively for you that way. DevOps is more or less a textbook that explains from front to back how DevOps methodology works, those three ways, et cetera, et cetera. And the Phoenix Project is more or less a case study. It's actually a novel. It takes a fictional company called Parts Unlimited, and you're following the career of this individual as he gets put into a position of leadership in his IT hierarchy and adopting, going from more of a monolithic, old school mode 1 approach to IT to a DevOps agile orientation. Between those two books, and you can get them both on Audible too. I tend to consume a lot of my reading audibly. You can get those in Audible as an audiobook format as well. Okay, so given that, now let's hone our discussion in more tightly and look at how Microsoft implements DevOps in Azure. And as you probably know, Microsoft is a dog fooding company, which means that they use their own products. So they use Azure DevOps internally, as well as sell and support it to us customers. First thing that you should know of is just that there's two ways to interact with Azure DevOps. It's globally going to be a suite of interrelated tools that support this notion of DevOps, delivering continuous value to your end users. On the left of the slide, Azure DevOps Services is the Azure hosted Azure DevOps, and that's what we're going to use. There's also a locally hosted version of Azure DevOps called Azure DevOps Server. Fun fact, did you know that GitHub, which Microsoft actually owns, has an on-premises version as well? Yeah, so this is for businesses whose security, governance, compliance, etc. prohibits them from using a public cloud service. You can do Azure DevOps all entirely with your own infrastructure. So you own the whole environment. I guess that's a plus, but what would be a trade-off that you can think of? If you've been with me so far through this seminar series, you know that the cloud is all about trade-offs, isn't it? Thinking of infrastructure as a service and platform as a service. Yeah. Well, one that comes to my mind is performance. Because Azure DevOps has that pooled resource model, you can scale your compute layer up and out, horizontally and vertically to the nth degree, because that's the nature of the public cloud. Azure DevOps uses the Azure backbone as its compute layer. So you've got predictable performance that's instantly and nearly infinitely scalable. Whereas with Azure DevOps Server, if you're hosting it locally, unless you've got multi-site redundancy built into that infrastructure, if your data center has a massive power outage, or here in Nashville, we had a terrible flood in 2010, that knocks out the whole center, you're hosed, you're offline, aren't you? And there's also the potential for unpredictable performance because you're doing the compute tier all yourself, and you probably don't have the cap, what is it called? You don't have the economy of scale that Microsoft might have. Maybe you do, who knows? The next few slides in the deck just present some quick screenshots just to get an image in your head of each of the different primary members of the Azure DevOps product family. Each one has a very intentional purpose, and I personally admire deeply how nicely integrated each of the products in Azure DevOps is. And you want to know something else that I think is cool? That not only are the internal Azure DevOps tools nicely integrated among themselves, but there's great capacity for integrating Azure DevOps with other services and systems. That is, you can build pipelines for your build and release processes using Azure Pipelines, but you may be getting your source code from GitHub or Bitbucket, or just a network file share in your on-premises environment. You see what I mean? And if you don't want to use the Azure Pipelines build server, you can use Jenkins. So there's lots and lots of, there's an interrelationship here, internally and even outside of Azure DevOps. In fact, a common question that you might have yourself is, what is the future of Azure DevOps, given the fact that Microsoft purchased GitHub not too long ago, and they're doing a lot of innovation in both places? I actually, on my Twitter handle, I got a senior person at GitHub to answer that question, and I'm just paraphrasing her. Her name's Sasha Rosenbaum, I believe. But if I remember what she said, that they both will have their place for the foreseeable future. In other words, we shouldn't just abandon Azure DevOps in favor of GitHub. They both have their place for different businesses. But it seems like most new real innovation is going to happen on GitHub as opposed to Azure DevOps. So I just present that for your consideration. Anyway, this slide shows Azure boards. And this is like a work board, a Kanban type board or Trello type board, where your team, depending upon what your project management methodology is, you can track your work items. In fact, there's a number of different views there. Azure Repos is the source code repository component of Azure DevOps, and you can use Git. Git is the standard, but you can also use I was going to call Team Foundation version control legacy, but it's more of the Microsoft's proprietary centralized version control. Git is, at least in my humble or not so humble opinion, kind of a world standard nowadays. The Azure Pipelines component, this is where you build your automation for both building your application and doing all of your automated testing, as well as your release. And by release, it's important to understand here, you're not just talking about slam dunking your application code on some servers somewhere. You can include the infrastructure in the release definition itself, which means that we as Azure administrators have a really vital part to play here in understanding that. The whole concept, once again, is infrastructure as code. All right, and there's different ways to do those pipelines. This is a graphic somewhere from the Azure DevOps documentation that walks through at a high level. The idea is that your developers are working on your line of business application that's going to run in Azure. It could be an app service. Maybe you're doing Docker containers where you're going to run ultimately a pod in AKS, Azure Kubernetes Service. Doesn't really matter, but the developer, the key here is that they can use their own preferred development tools, their own preferred development languages. Remember, I think it was session 3, Platform as a Service, in which we looked at Azure App Service going far beyond the .NET Framework or .NET Core. That if you're running a mean stack or a LAMP stack application, no problem. You've got first-class support for it in Azure. Long story short, your developers using their familiar tools, commit using a familiar source code management tool like Git into an Azure cloud-hosted repo. Now, you can configure your build pipelines to automatically trigger based on a commit. And there's a whole bunch of intermediate layers that we don't have the time to get into, but you can do, for example, policies in your Git repo such that when a developer does push their code change to your repository, it stops there in a queue and waits for some kind of human approval. Maybe you've combined automated testing routines and human-based. You can create these gates at various stages in your pipeline process, all in the name of not upsetting the system. It's kind of funny. Once you really start getting under the hood with Azure DevOps, as an administrator now, really would love to see the light in your eyes if they do start to illuminate more when you realize that it's not, DevOps is not necessarily an either or thing. I've talked to so many IT pros, and I was one of them once, who thought, oh man, all this continuous integration, continuous deployment business, we need stability and sanity in our infrastructure. You know, I still, to this very moment, can emphasize with that pretty deeply. But on the other hand, if you're architecting your pipelines in a good way, keeping those 3 ways in mind, fast feedback, fast failure, fast fixing, the idea is that you're catching anything that breaks something or violates a compliance, or hopefully not a law, but violates a checkbox in your compliance certifications, etc. You're catching those early in the process, and the fast feedback loop means that your developers and other stakeholders get apprised of this, and so they can take action faster than hopefully ever before. So as I said, that commit into the source code branch can trigger off a build operation that can include automated and should include automated testing. This diagram then goes into a release pipeline stage where you take what's called the artifact, the output of the application build. That state gets tracked as what Azure DevOps calls an artifact. And you would use that in all likelihood as an input into your release pipeline. And again, that can be automatically triggered when a new artifact shows up. That trips off the release pipeline, or you can always manually control the operation of the build and or release pipelines. Again, it's not all or nothing is what I'm trying to say. And then as far as that release and that deployment goes, the reason why there's vertical arrows coming out of both the build and release pipelines is that you can deploy infrastructure in either of those pipelines. And in Azure, again, we do that with Azure Resource Manager templates. I would bet you, I haven't, to my knowledge, talked to anybody who's used, say, Terraform. I would imagine it's possible to use a non-Azure Resource Manager template like Terraform files, config files, in these pipelines. If Microsoft doesn't support it natively, the chances are fantastic there is an extension that you can add into Azure DevOps that would support that external service. What else in here before we jump into the formal demo? Another member of the Azure DevOps family is called test plans, and that's where you can create, punch lists where your QA people go to the web application and put a product in your bucket and then go to checkout, those sort of things. And there's also a newer feature built into there, and a more interactive exploratory thing, where your QA people can load up an Azure DevOps, I forgot what it's called, I think it's called the Test and Feedback extension. It's a Chrome extension. And they can explore your application and file bug reports all directly from within the context of the extension. It's really thoughtful. It's a pretty cool product. All of that, again, like I said, is part of Azure. All of these bug reports and work items are all interrelated and trackable within Azure DevOps ecosystem. And then away you go. There's a screenshot. We're going to go into the demo in just a minute, so I can jump past those pretty quickly. Let me see if there's anything else preliminarily before we get into our demo formally. Okay, yeah, we're good. So let's head on over to the Azure portal, and we actually don't need the Azure portal. We're going to need the Azure DevOps portal. This is a little bit confusing because really Azure DevOps has a free tier. You can just do Azure DevOps pricing. But there's really not, it seems to me, a whole lot you can do unless you've got it plugged into a subscription, because your infrastructure is going to be deployed in Azure, at least, especially if you're looking at certifying as an Azure DevOps engineer. It's only going to be Azure DevOps. It's not going to be even GitHub to that matter. So you've got DevOps that has its own pricing structure, as you can see here. It looks like the basic plan has the first 5 users free, and then it's per user per month. And then if you want the test plan's capability, that really dramatically increases the cost per user per month, doesn't it? But I just want to drill in here that Azure DevOps Services, it rides on top of Azure services, but they're separate. And so whereas in Azure, there's portal.azure.com, in Azure DevOps, it's dev.azure.com. And when you come into Azure DevOps for the first time, you create what's called an organization. So the way the structure, the logical structure of Azure DevOps is at the top tier is the organization. And then an organization can have n number of projects, and then each project has teams and specifically your repos and your pipelines and your artifacts and your test plans, et cetera, et cetera. Quick walkthrough of the user interface here. Across the top, the global navigation, you can always come back to the home page of your org by clicking Azure DevOps. In the upper right, your user properties show up very similarly to how the Azure portal does it. Specifically here, you can have under your user settings menu, the personal access token. It's an easy way to authenticate within Azure DevOps. You can use a personal access token. Same idea as what's in GitHub with personal access tokens. And as I said, there's an extension model built into Azure DevOps. This little shopping cart icon will allow you to go there, and you can browse out in the Visual Studio Marketplace. Let's see what some of the most popular are. Yeah, Test and Feedback is the name of that extension that goes with Azure Test Plans that supports discovery. Some of the other major extensions that you see, some of which are actually referenced on the AZ400 certification exam actually, are some of the ones that are third-party partners that you load in to extend the functionality of Azure DevOps. And one category, I should say, that's pretty popular are the security tools. Like if you're doing an open source project, you might want to load in an open source vulnerability scanner extension. Or you might, what are some other ones? I know SonarQube is one type. What is this one? Is this a source code control extension? So the idea is that you can load in these third-party extensions to add in these additional capabilities. You add it into your organization and consume them in your projects. All right, another final point that I know when I was brand new to this interface, I was kind of like, okay, what do I look at first? The paradigm, the user interface paradigm here is that at your level, you've got on the left-hand side your categories, I guess, or elements, but in the lower left is where you get your settings at that scope level. So at the organization level, the top level, some things here that are useful to look at, of course, are your users. And where are your users going to be coming from? They're going to be coming from your Azure Active Directory tenant, aren't they? Because you've gone under billing and you've linked one or more Azure subscriptions into your organization, like I said. You can look at your usage, there's your extensions, there's your Azure Active Directory service extension, some security. Security in Azure DevOps is not a fun subject. I don't envy any of my Pluralsight colleagues who have to teach Azure DevOps security. Azure DevOps uses a role-based access control, or RBAC, like Azure does, but this is just my opinion, that's all it is, but it's pretty needlessly complex in my humble opinion. And that's unfortunate because normally, at least my understanding of best practice security is you want granular least privilege access. So you really need to understand your relationships between your roles and groups to do that, and it's pretty complicated here. You've got the concept of agent pools in your Azure DevOps organization, and this is going to be where you create compute environments for your pipelines. Your pipeline tasks are going to need a layer of compute to do the grinding. And there's at least a couple types of these. You might have a pool of Mac computers, because you're maybe developing an iOS application or a Mac OS app, so wouldn't it make sense your build servers would need to be Macs? Or a Linux type server or service that requires Linux or Windows. A common one is the hosted VS 2017, which are Windows virtual machines that have Visual Studio installed, and all of those build tools are already there. And once you start getting deeper into this, you can create your own pools, including, what do they call it? Self-hosted, I think, is what Microsoft calls it, where you can include on-premises physical or virtual machines and create a compute layer for your pipelines there as well. So these are just some of the elements that, as an administrator, points to look at and things for you to bookmark mentally or physically to take a closer look at. If we go into a specific project, I've got one here called Pluralsight Parts Unlimited. This is where now we're in the project scope, and we can get specifically to each member of the Azure DevOps family, as you can see here, including this time it's the project settings. And this is where you get to your teams, where you're building teams, your developers, your QA, your security people, your auditors, and your role-based permissions. And again, there's inheritance here where you set permissions at the org level, will scope down through all of your projects, and then your project scope can scope down through all or some of the products that are in your project that you've enabled, you see. Anything else that's jumping out? Again, there's connectivity into your agent pools, which are your compute layers underneath your pipelines. Service connections, this is important because in your pipelines, especially as an administrator, you may want to run ARM templates. Let's say that your team is developing a .NET Core web application, and it's going to run an Azure App Service. So you're going to need to have an environment in your Azure subscription to host the app, right? So you might need one or more Azure SQL Server databases and virtual servers. You may need an app service, an instance of App Insights. So in order to tap into your subscription, that's using what Microsoft calls a service connection here. And what's beautiful here, as I said several minutes ago, is that we can go far beyond the Microsoft campus here. If we're going to connect to one of our subscriptions, we would go Azure Resource Manager, but look, Chef, Docker, Hub, Jenkins, Jira, Kubernetes. You can go far beyond just Microsoft ecosystem. And what's nice about that is that that's an authorization channel to that service. And then you can start to add components in your build and release pipelines that go across those service connections. All right, Arino, well, let's dive in here. This is a sample project. I'll show you where I got it. This is a fully fleshed out Azure DevOps organization, or Azure DevOps project. And it was created by Microsoft to mirror the Parts Unlimited company in the Phoenix project book. So it should be actually pretty familiar to you if you've read that book. And so in Azure repos, we can browse the source code of the code base. We can review commits, the full commit history over time. Anytime a developer has pushed code to the repository, whether you're doing pull requests where you basically submit a request to merge and then you go through an approval testing process and then you're merged in. There's different methodologies on how you do branches. What I'm accustomed to is what's called the feature branch motif, where you've got your master or trunk branch. That's the source of authority for your code base. And then as a developer, you create a branch, which is effectively a clone of that main code branch, and you'd make your changes on your branch, and then you merge your branch back into master. There's another methodology called git flow that's much more complicated, where there you're kind of branching off the main trunk several layers. If you do that, you're worthy of my respect. That's above my proverbial pay grade. But if you've worked with Git source code control, and Git, if you're not familiar, is a decentralized source code management system. You install the Git client and command line tools on your system. There's GUI front-end clients for Git. But the idea is each developer downloads a full copy of the repository to their system. And then as they make their changes, they periodically push those changes. For example, here on the files page in this Parts Unlimited repo, I can get the clone URL right here, copying it to my clipboard. And then depending on what my IDE is, I might want to use Visual Studio Code, for instance. I can say, okay, why don't I clone a copy of that repository to my system here. Let me see, it looks like I'm in a folder, so let me close out of my folder. And let's do a clone repository. All I've done on this machine that you're looking at is I installed the Git client. If you go to git-scm.com, that's one way. That's how I normally install the Git client. Then I installed Visual Studio Code. That's it. I can paste in Control-V, my clone URL, specify where on my system I want to download the repository. And because this is an Azure DevOps, it's not going to be anonymous access here. So I do have whatever the Azure DevOps equivalent is of owner is, I have that. So hopefully I can just sign in with my Azure AD credentials. Didn't like that. Let me type nice and slow. There we go. So we're going to pull down that entire code base, and the idea is now we can work on it locally. Make whatever change we need to. So in here, this is a full application. It's an ASP.NET web application. I believe the JSON templates are under env templates. Yeah, there's one called full environment setup merge, as you can see here. So if you've worked with Azure Resource Manager templates as an administrator, bully, this is a fine spot. In Visual Studio Code, you probably want to install some additional extensions. In VS Code, you can go to the extensions gallery and just do a search for Azure Resource Manager. Microsoft makes the Azure Resource Manager Tools extension. This is going to light up language support and debugging support, I think, for Azure, for ARM syntax, JSON syntax. And if you're going to use PowerShell, you can't go wrong by installing the PowerShell extension. And you want to install the Azure PowerShell modules on your system as well. That's really the least viable, the minimum viable product to get productive in VS Code when you're working on ARM templates. Notice that once you've done that and you're working in your repository, let me do that again, full environment setup merged, there it is. We've got the ARM template outliner, which is kind of cool. It's just meant to be an easier way to navigate the different components of the template. So I can step through my parameters here just using this little outliner. Visual Studio, which also comes in a community free edition, Visual Studio 2019 Community it's called, and it runs on both Windows Server and Mac OS. Visual Studio Code, all three, Linux, Mac OS, and Windows. I'm going to make a trivial change here. I'm going to change this default value to Tim, because the point isn't the code itself. The point is we've got our Git client that's tracking those changes here, and we've got in VS Code the native integration with source code providers. So now I'm going to commit this change. I think it should be auto-staged. I'm going to say edit PUL DB login, and I'm going to commit that change. Yeah, there are no stage changes to commit. Would you like to automatically stage your changes? Yeah, you may or may not agree with that choice, but it's an easy option. And that's one of the many neat things about VS Code. It can pop up these helpful things for you. If we can open up the ellipsis menu here, I'm going to now push that code change up to the origin, the source. How do I know what that is? Would I like code to, here's another example of VS Code helping us. Git fetch is a way for Git to go across the channel to the remote, in other words, to the upstream source of this code, and pull back any changes. I'm going to answer yes to that. It won't merge them, but it'll at least record those changes for us. I can do, for instance, in my terminal session here, I can do a git remote -v to just do a sanity check that my upstream here is my Tim Werner organization running in Azure DevOps. Now, that push evidently succeeded. I can, of course, verify that in Azure repos itself. Yeah, there it is up here. And depending upon how you've set your policies up, you might require pull requests and approval workflow to take place. You can do other security things on your commits, but the Git functionality here in Azure DevOps should be immediately familiar if you've used Git elsewhere. But now, what's important here, I don't know actually how this branch, this master branch is set up. It says that the commit is in progress. It should, quote unquote, kick off a build pipeline. Because if we go in our Azure DevOps project under Pipelines, this will show any build pipelines that we've built. And the build pipeline is chief responsibilities are for compiling your application, running any unit or integration testing. Most likely it's to integrate a new commit from a developer, and then outputting that application into the next phase, which in all likelihood is going to be your release pipeline. So it's going to be output as an artifact. It looks like that pipeline is in fact running right now. We can see that the last run is just now. It's in process, edit PUL DB login. So we can view the pipeline progress here and drill right into it. And Azure DevOps will show us step by step what it's doing each time. And if there's any problems, they'll show up in this interface here. It looks like we've got a couple warnings. If it actually bombs out and errors out totally, we'll be able to see those results immediately. Again, that's all in keeping with that notion of flow and short feedback cycles, short feedback loops. So this is our parts unlimited build pipeline. The user interface isn't the most intuitive I've ever seen, to be perfectly honest with you. You can manually run the build pipeline to actually see what it's doing, to look at its definition here. We can go to edit. And this again takes us down into another kettle of fish that we don't really need to get into. But the long story short is that graphically, Azure DevOps appears to be gradually moving away from this graphical scheme here, where you see on the left in our tasks list, a collection of phases. First, we're going to get the source code. Where is the source code? This was written already. So you would do this yourself as you're creating the pipeline. But the author of this build pipeline obviously is saying we're going to pull from Azure repos Git. You can go to all sorts of other sources, and you just go right down to the branch that you want to base this on. Let's see. And then we're going to do a phase here where we're running the build process on an agent pool, and you can choose which of those pools you want. Remember, you can use the Visual Studio Windows one, you could use Mac OS or Linux-based pools, you can do self-hosted pools that use your own systems. You have to specify a compute where you want to run the work. And then, as I said, at least now in the build pipeline, you have the option of using this graphical method, where you can literally choose these pre-done job tasks and just basically fill in the form in order to configure it. So this is a .NET Stack application. So we're going to do a NuGet restore to pull all of our package dependencies. The manifest file is going to be in the source code, packages.config. Then using the Visual Studio build engine, we're going to run through all of those MS build things. Looks like there's a test step where we're running a series of tests, unit tests, integration tests. Again, we need to path out where those are located, where to load them up. Then it looks like normally, in my experience, a build pipeline is going to end with a copy where once the application has been compiled, built, tested, and if it passes to that point, it'll all be slammed into maybe a zip file or the equivalent and then published as an artifact. Now, what I was saying is that although right now anyway, you can build these pipelines using these graphical doodads, for lack of a better term, the path forward is to use code, really, to do the pipeline definitions. And the format is YAML, which stands for, I think, yet another markup language. And the idea is that these definitions aren't supposed to be too difficult or gnarly to interpret with the naked eye. And because eventually, the idea is, your build and release pipelines will themselves be in YAML format, you can keep the definition files in Azure repos as well. So you've got your application fully, all of its code base in the repo. You've got the infrastructure environment on which the application runs, declaratively in JSON or Terraform or whatever. And you even have the pipeline definitions themselves committed in source code control. And remember, the benefits of source code control is that every change to those files is tracked, and you can roll back selectively when you need to. And also, you've got collaboration among multiple parties who may be working on the same files at the same time. I remember 20 years ago, was it? Oh my gosh, I worked for a company called Transcender, and they were using Visual Source Safe, the developers were, and they were always hollering down the hall at each other to unlock or release, check back in a file, because only one person could have read-write access to a file at a time in a centralized source code mechanism, okay? So this is the graphical build pipeline. If we step back to our menu here and go to releases, that's the other phase. And here I've got the parts unlimited release pipeline. Let me edit this. This particular test project, again, uses the graphical layer, but you can also define your release pipeline just strictly using that YAML markup language. And it's all the syntax and all of that is in the documentation. The graphical I like because it just pops to the eye a little bit easier. We can see here we start the release process here at the artifacts level. And we've specified, and this switch, this trigger, actually, I should have showed it a moment ago. It also is available on the build pipeline. In the build pipeline, the deployment trigger is going to be a code commit into the proper branch of the repo. For your release, the normal pattern, the continuous deployment trigger, in other words, says every time there's a new build of the application, trigger off. So you see how that flow works in general? Code commit trips off the build pipeline. If that fails or generates errors, you stop and you notify through the short feedback loop. If the tests pass and the code compiles properly, you output an artifact. Boom, the presence of that artifact is the trigger that trips off your release pipeline. And this particular release pipeline is doing a staged deployment where we're deploying the application to 3 environments: Dev, QA, and production. And notice that each one of these phases selectively has its own trigger. And you can do after release, after stage, or manual. So you can always override the automatic deployment. But each one of these stages is going to consist of a job and 1 or more tasks. It looks like this dev environment is again using the graphical rather than the YAML. It's doing an Azure deployment step, which is going to give us our infrastructure. And I happen to know, because I've run this application several times, it's going to create an Azure SQL database with a connection string. It's going to create an app service instance that uses the connection string to connect it to the database. So it does all of that. How does Azure DevOps know what to do? Well, in this graphical outlay, you just fill in the blanks. You just browse into your Azure subscription, and then the definition of this Azure deployment step, as you can see in the dropdown, you would just choose what you want it to do. In this case, create or update a resource group. Remember that Azure Resource Manager deployments are idempotent, which means you're not going to be harming your existing environment if it's already there. So it doesn't matter. You can keep redoing the pipeline. It's not going to delete and then recreate the environment. It's going to check to make sure that the environment is what it should be. If any parts are missing, reruns of the release pipeline will replace them. And that's a good thing from an administrator standpoint, it seems to me, because one of our goals as administrators is to make sure that the infrastructure is free of configuration drift. We need that infrastructure to stay within the lines, as it were. There's the concept of variables, as you can see here, and those are tracked in a separate page. So you can, you really can have fun, honestly. If you like puzzles, I like that aspect of Azure DevOps a whole lot. I mean, it's not fun when the pressure's on. That's another whole kettle of fish. But if you have the time to relax and just experiment in here, it can really be quite interesting and satisfying. Ultimately, for this Azure deployment, we're pathing using variables. What's the default working directory of the artifact? And then we're drilling into the source to get to the JSON. And this one has a parameter file as well as a template. And the deployment mode here, remember I said idempotent? By default, your Azure deployments are all incremental, but you could do complete, which would whack everything that's in the resource group and deploy what's in the template. Or anything that's deployed that's not in the template, is more accurate to say, will be whacked. The Azure App Service deploy is a built-in step, and this is simply going to make sure that the code gets shipped over into the new Azure App Service. You see what we're doing here? You're just, as an administrator, you're defining the environment into which the application gets plugged in. Hitting the little plus, this shows you, just gives you an idea of some of the other tasks that are available natively in Azure DevOps. And notice that there's a marketplace. This allows you to tap into the Visual Studio Marketplace to bring in third-party or even community-built extensions that you can add. So just what are some things that jump in here? .NET Core. App Center is a kind of, I define it as a sub-platform in Azure DevOps. It's good for when you're building mobile apps in particular. So anyway, I've got 5 minutes left before it's break time. I want to show you how, with minimum muss, fuss, or greasy aftertaste, thanks to Mark Manassi for that. I learned that from him 20 years ago. I want to show you how, if you have an Azure subscription, hopefully it's an Azure subscription that runs on credit, so it's not hitting your wallet directly, that you can get started with Azure DevOps. I'm going to share 2 sites. Obviously, there's the Pluralsight ones, of course, but there's 2 non-Pluralsight sites that I need you to be aware of. One is called the Azure DevOps Demo Generator. If you do a Google search for that, you'll come to this web application. You sign in with your Azure AD or Microsoft account, and there's a whole bunch of templates in here. I've been using Parts Unlimited, but notice there's a whole bunch of others. And these are just on the general page. There's another page here called DevOps Labs. These are they're Azure DevOps projects and templates that function hand in hand with pre-done Azure DevOps walkthrough labs. That's your second site, Azure DevOps Labs.com. This is a collection of hands-on labs. It doesn't cover everything in Azure DevOps, but it covers most. And almost all of them are built on a demo environment that's over here in the Azure DevOps Demo Generator. Cool, huh? Microsoft Learn, this taps transparently into all of the Azure DevOps lab modules that are in the Microsoft Learn ecosystem. Azure Community, I don't know what that is, honestly. And private, create your own templates. Interesting, cool. So seriously, Azure DevOps Demo Generator and Azure DevOps Labs.com. Now, if you're fortunate enough to be a Pluralsight subscriber, I'm the kind of nerd that I watch a lot of training, obviously Pluralsight, but even other than Pluralsight. And my favorite Azure DevOps trainer in the world, I'm so grateful to say, is a Pluralsight colleague. What you'll want to do at our site is look up the Azure DevOps Role IQ. It's Microsoft Azure DevOps Engineer. We've talked about Role IQ and Skill IQ over the last several sessions. Specifically, just to cut right to the chase, my favorite trainer, and he didn't pay me, he doesn't even know I'm plugging him, but his name is Marcel de Vries. I think he's from Belgium or the Netherlands, but he's fantastic. He covers each element of the Azure DevOps Engineer Certification Exam, the AZ400 certification exam. He's got one called The Big Picture that's an overview of the whole ecosystem. Then he goes into each category in Azure DevOps. Fantastic. So it seems to me that studying Marcel's courses and then layering that in with Azure DevOps Demo Generator and those hands-on labs, perfection. As far as a practice test go, at Pluralsight, we partner with what used to be called Kaplan IT. Now they're called, I always forget it because it's such a generic name, Kaplan IT Practice Exams, Cyber Vista. That's what they're called. I'm not sure if they have AZ400 practice exams or not, to be perfectly honest with you. Cyber Vista AZ400 would probably be the fastest way to go. but that's what you would want to check if you have practice exams as part of your Pluralsight subscription. If not, I find that I get a huge amount of benefit from wizlabs.com. In fact, I used their AZ400 practice exams when I was studying to take the Azure DevOps engineer exam, and I passed with flying colors, so take that for what it's worth. All right? Anything else before we go to Q&A? Let me jump to the end of the slide deck. At the very least, let's take a look at my homework assignment for you. Let me just bring out all three elements. Study Marcel's course, Continuous Delivery with DevOps and Azure DevOps, the big picture. Create a free Azure DevOps account or organization is what I meant to say, and use the demo generator. There's a short link to it, by the way, timw.info/dgen. And I've even given you a short link to the AzureDevOpsLabs.com site. That's timw.info/ADL. That, and remember the books at the beginning that I told you about, the Phoenix Project and the DevOps Handbook? Really, all of those resources, you dive into those. I have infinite confidence in you. Go forth, Padawan, or whatever the appropriate nerd expression is. There's my contact details, Tech Trainer Tim on Twitter, or you could, techtrainertim.com is my website. You can hit my Pluralsight page there and we can communicate there. It's all good, I'm there for you. With that, Alyssa, it looks like my timer just expired. Any questions in the queue that I can entertain at this time?
We have about 11 right now, and I'm sure we'll have more trickle in. So I'm going to start out with this one. I am looking to get a job as an Azure admin. I'm currently an on-prem system engineer. I've passed AZ-103 recently, and I have deployed many test projects while preparing it and have created repos and GitHub for automation and documentation. Most companies are looking for experienced cloud admins. How do I work on production projects when my company is not ready to move to cloud as the data center is built highly resilient?
Right. Well, what comes to mind, first of all, congrats on passing Azure Administrator. That's a significant accomplishment for sure. What immediately came to my mind is to get involved at github.com, especially if you're more on the administration side. Let's hook up on Twitter, and I'm happy to make some introductions to some community members who do a lot of great work in PowerShell, let's say, just as an example, in GitHub. And by contributing there, you're not only developing your actual skills with a whole bunch of stuff, including DevOps, but you also can call yourself an open source contributor because you'll be able to share your GitHub with prospective employers and demonstrate that you've added value to community projects. So definitely take advantage of that. Start contributing to projects, even if it's something, I know the whole imposter syndrome stuff. I would tend to start, because I'm a writer myself, at documentation. Go into the shallow end of the pool, although I wouldn't want to put down docs and call it shallow end of the pool. But you don't necessarily have to do anything really ambitious to get started. Think of the fact that all of the Azure docs are open source. You can think of a good example to add to an Azure doc and then submit those as pull requests. And if Microsoft merges your changes, you've contributed not only to an open source project, but by contributing to Microsoft Docs, I mean, that's an industry leading knowledge base. And you can leverage all of that experience and all that documentation in your career as you go forward.
Our next one reads, hey, I'm currently infrastructure based, and for the last couple of years, I've branched into Microsoft 365 and now Azure. I've never had to deal with coding before other than some fairly basic intermediate PowerShell. For future career prospects, will I be required to have considerably better development knowledge?
Certainly, if you're looking to work for a company that has adopted Azure DevOps and some of the associated project methodologies like Agile or Scrum, then you're going to need to speak the language. Certainly there's businesses you can find that are still what Gartner calls Mode 1 IT, where you're fine. You can, if you're happy being in your sandbox and working in RDP and not having to worry about scripting automation, I mean, that's fine. Again, as Jerry Seinfeld said, there's not that there's anything wrong with that. But I do humbly recommend that in order to maximize your future, your current and future value in the industry, start taking baby steps more in the DevOps ecosystem. In other words, these PowerShell scripts that you're developing, if they're not in source code, keep them in source code. Work on community projects with other people at GitHub to get a feel for working collaboratively with other developers. Yeah, I'd say that yeah. keep on trucking with the coding, even if you're not going to go into a formal development language like C# or Java or JavaScript for that matter. Even with PowerShell, there's a lot you can do here to maximize your life, your shelf life in the industry. Hope that makes sense.
And the second part to that one, to add on to it, they want to know if you have any recommendations about the best place for them to start regarding development. Should they try C#?
Well, of course, it depends on what kind of development we're talking about here. I mean, if you're talking about web application development, are you talking about more front end, back end, or full stack? It kind of becomes a complex decision tree, doesn't it? You could split the difference and focus on a general purpose programming language. Or some might argue that PowerShell is not a programming language, it's a scripting automation language. Maybe you might want to look at Python. Python would be a good example of a programming language that shares most of the similarities with, say, C# or enterprise class programming languages, but also Python is made to be friendly and usable in just about any use case. You can integrate Python across just about all of Azure, from infrastructure stuff to machine learning to data platform. You can integrate Python in terms of building web servers. There's whole Python-based web frameworks for that matter. So maybe instead of C#, unless you really want to get down into the weeds, I would recommend you take a look at Python just as a real true Swiss Army knife programming language to see if it's something that matches your aptitude. You realize, yes, I'm actually starting to pick up this object-oriented stuff, in which case you're much farther off to transition to Java or C# or even JavaScript for that matter. And at the same time, it's aptitude and interest. You may realize, yeah, I'm good at it, but I'm not really a fan. And that's good to know, because you don't want to have a career in which you're doing work that you don't enjoy.
If you're looking for somewhere to start, like I don't know where this person is on their journey, but we did have that web development seminar series. So those will be in the platform within the next couple of weeks. So if you're just starting on your journey in the development world and you're just trying to get your feet wet and see where you want to go, that will be a really good opportunity for you to get that on-ramp to deciding. And again, that'll be available in the next couple of weeks freely on the platform.
And if you're a Pluralsight subscriber, we do have a subset of our interactive course library available. And I don't remember offhand if there was anything in Python, but it seems to me there would be. So that's another avenue to consider, interactive coding courses that you can do right in your browser.
Awesome. Okay, next one. This person wants to know, why was the DevOps part included in Microsoft Azure Administrator Series?
I'm not sure if you're asking why did I devote this as a section of the seminar series, or if you're wondering about the Azure certification. Let me just address both. Azure DevOps is not mentioned in the Azure Administrator role-based certification, but I decided to add it intentionally as a lesson in this seminar series because of the fact that DevOps is not something that's going away. It's something that is real and is growing, and it's growing because it really works when it's implemented intelligently. And I wanted to make sure to give you as much present and future value in your careers. And I would be remiss as an instructor if I didn't present some DevOps. And the reason why I went to Azure DevOps specifically is because the context of this seminar series is Azure Administrator, and Azure DevOps is the DevOps solution in Azure. So there you have it, a peek behind the curtain.
Thanks, Tim. Our next one is, are there any MS docs for best practices and build pipelines for passwords that you know of?
Oh yeah, sure. Secrets management I'm thinking of, and of course the ultimate top level concern is that we never ever want to have secrets exposed in our source code. For instance, if you were to upload a code change into your GitHub repo and you accidentally included an API key or something that was clearly formatted as a password, GitHub there's a third-party SaaS platform, I forgot what it's called, but it's constantly monitoring and scanning for that kind of stuff. And you'll get an email almost instantly, hey, you committed something you shouldn't to your code. And that's a great sanity check. Failing that, yes, Azure DevOps has docs on how to do secrets management. You kind of know where it's going to go in a sense, because remember, Microsoft owns all of this. They created all of this. And if you've ever heard of a little product called Azure Key Vault, you can expect that, yes, absolutely, there are tasks, pre-built tasks for both build and release pipeline stages where you can tap in using your Azure Service Connection into your subscription, into an Azure Key Vault to fetch, whether it's a digital certificate you need, an encryption key, or a password or a passphrase. Absolutely. That's what you're going to find, just to cut to the chase, to let the proverbial cat out of the bag in the docs. But I guarantee you, essentially, that you could also, for instance, in your build or release pipelines, fetch a secret from a third-party secret management platform like LastPass Enterprise, Thycotic Secret Server. I think HashiCorp has a secrets management solution. I essentially guarantee it. Like, just for grins, let me quickly do a search here. Azure DevOps Pipeline, and then let me say Thycotic Secret Server. And let's just see what comes back. DevOps Secrets Management. Looks like Thycotic itself has some stuff here. Azure, yeah, of course, sure. Yeah, so you should never, the only time there should ever be a secret showing up in your source code is through human error. Let's put it that way. Hopefully you've got automation in place to catch that if it ever does happen, and you can securely fetch secrets without ever exposing the plain text of that secret by using Azure Key Vault or another product.
To go off of that, one of our learners says, just be warned that the graphical version of AZDO pipelines is going away in the future and will be replaced with YAML files only.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I made that point in the demo, didn't I?
Yep.
That part's unlimited. In fact, matter of fact, let me go back to that Azure DevOps generator page. Azure DevOps demo generator. The good folks at Microsoft, I don't know who it was who made those demo environments. I guess I can't talk and type at the same time. But they've actually made a template for Parts Unlimited that is just YAML, this one right here. So notice that there's the Parts Unlimited that uses it's not officially legacy, but your point is well taken that going forward, it's going to be all YAML for the reasons I mentioned. You can store those YAML pipeline definitions in your code and track their life cycle right along everything else. YAML is the smarter way to go. There's no question about it. I would say just for a newbie, it might be useful to use the graphical. But yeah, your point's well taken. YAML is definitely going to be eventually the only way to define these pipelines in Azure DevOps.
Next one reads, to add or remove NIC in an Azure VM, does it need to be stopped? Don't you think this is one of the basic things that has not been implemented in Azure? Or is Azure testing our planning skills?
All right, so the question deals, and now for something completely different. Let me go to another VM so I don't mess up the one that I'm teaching from. The networking in your virtual machine, you might know, the TCP/IP specifically comes from the network interface. So the question is dissociating or detaching the network interface from a running VM. I'm not sure why I would want to do that necessarily, but just for the sake of conversation, let's go in here. Go to IP configs. Where do I disassociate it? Yeah. Long story short, I don't know. I don't know why I would. If I were to disassociate the network interface, the times that I've needed to do that, I was going to actually delete the VM and reuse the network interface elsewhere. So I guess I can't go any further with your question. As a general guiding principle, though, and this is good information for any administrator, two things that come to mind. One is that you never ever want to mess with your virtual machine's TCP/IP configuration from within the VM. I'm actually on an Azure VM right now. You can see up on the top my RDP banner. And it's a common and understandable thing to RDP in, and then, for example, I might have showed you this earlier in this series, think to yourself, I want to add a static IP address to this machine. And on premises, of course, you'd go to the networking properties, the protocol properties, and you would make your change. If you do that here, you're going to lock yourself out of the VM. So all of your TCP/IP configuration needs to be done from the Azure control plane. And specifically, that's done in the context of the virtual network interface, not the VM itself. So that's one point. The second point is that generally speaking, when you're horsing around with the TCP/IP configuration of the VM, it's going to reboot. In other words, Azure is going to need to restart the VM in order to initiate the change anyway. And that's just a fact of life, but it's obviously something that's important to consider if you have line of business code running on the virtual machine and you have people actually connected to it, using it. They're not going to be too happy if the VM just reboots because you wanted to change the private IP address, you see. Hope that was illuminating in some way.
Thanks, Tim. Next one reads, why is there a need for build scripts?
Why can't you just do it? Well, I mean, if it's a if it's a traditional application, you're going to need to compile the code into an intermediary format at the very least anyway. So most applications are going to, if it's using a server-side framework, you're going to have a compilation step. That's just part of the cost of doing business. And if you're not working in Azure DevOps, you would be doing that on your workstation in, say, Visual Studio. You'd build the application and then you would deploy it. So why would you do that in Azure DevOps? Well, there's a lot of value that you can add. Number one, you could add the whole concept of continuous integration. Means that instead of the old pattern of maybe you release your line of business application, a new version of it every year, you can make changes to your production, customer-facing applications multiple times per day. Because the whole idea with continuous integration is when maybe a developer makes a feature change or does a bug fix or maybe even adds a new feature, that check-in, that commit, trips off the build process, which trips off testing, sanity checking, smoke testing, all of those terms. And then as I showed earlier, you can cascade that build pipeline into release and actually put changes in front of your customers far, far faster than we used to in software development. So why do you have to have a build step, a build pipeline? I guess you don't have to. It depends on your commitment to continuous integration and continuous delivery of value to your customers.
Our next two are kind of in the same vein, so I'm going to read both of them off for you. So the first one reads, is it possible to be on the operational side of DevOps, which doesn't require much programming language? And the second one also reads, is it also necessary to learn at least one programming language, or do Azure administrators, can they directly switch to DevOps?
Okay. Well, the first question, as an administrator, I thought I explained it, but I'm questioning myself now. No, you don't have to know anything about the application code itself, but as an operations professional, chances are really good that you're the person or you're on the team who needs to deploy and maintain the infrastructure on which the application that your developer colleagues have written will run. And part of the value proposition of DevOps in general and Azure DevOps in particular is that you can contribute meaningfully to the same code base as what the developers are using by storing your infrastructure scripts and your testing scripts in that same code base. So yeah, you'll be using some of the same tools. You won't have to know a lick of C# or Java or PHP, let's say, but you're contributing in a very integral way in the process because you're defining the infrastructure environment and you're including those steps in your build and release pipelines to make sure that every time the application gets pushed into an infrastructure environment, it's the way it should be according to you and your team's requirements. So yeah, administrators have a full seat at this table. And I didn't go into some of the other elements. I focused specifically on repos and pipelines today. But you can see here that if I jump up to the overview page, there's this concept of dashboards where each individual team member can see exactly what their work and their responsibilities are, and you can track all of those metrics. As an administrator, you can contribute to the knowledge base of your teams by using the wiki capability. You may get assigned tickets in your work item list, stuff that maybe the infrastructure needs a couple tweaks. Maybe you've noticed that the database is doing this, it's zigging when it's zagging. You're going to be a full team member, so you'll be using most of these tools the same exact way that the developers with. It's just that your focus is going to be different. You're not going to worry about the C# code. You'll be working on the infrastructure and keeping that nice and secure and performant and scalable, etc.
Thanks, Tim. Next up, is Microsoft Learn enough to pass the Azure Solution Architect exam?
No, I wouldn't say any one single source will ever cut the mustard or ever check all the boxes for passing an exam. I submit, and we'll get into this more in sessions 5 and 6, that it's really either a triangle or a three-legged stool is another way to look at it. Where a stool, for instance, with only one or two legs is worthless, right? So similarly, these three elements are going to be the theoretical knowledge, understanding. For solutions architect, it's going to be a little development and a little administrator, isn't it? There's theoretical, and yeah, Microsoft Learn, the documentation, Pluralsight courses can check that box. There's going to be a hands-on component. Nowadays, with COVID, it appears that worldwide learning at Microsoft has turned off the performance-based labs, but let's face it, you're going to have to know how to do the work either way. So there's figuring out how to get into a cloud sandbox. MS Learn can definitely help with that. We at Pluralsight are also developing cloud labs for Azure, so we'll eventually be able to check that box as well. And then the third leg of the stool, side of the triangle, is going to be your practice exams, because the way that you'll be evaluated is going to be through these multiple choice and interactive test items. And I've seen them throw people for a loop who hadn't invested the time in a quality practice exam like we were talking about earlier today. So I submit to you that you need to flex all of those muscles in order to be successful. Microsoft Learn can check a couple of the boxes, but not all three.
And kind of continuing with that thought, we have another question here. Would being an expert on the role IQ sections be a good indication that I am ready for the AZ-103, AZ-104 exam?
I'd say that if you've got one of the higher level classifications in our role IQ system, you're at least 2/3 of the way there. Again, to bring back my stool metaphor, role IQ at this point is definitely going to have you covered for the theory. And assuming, you know what they say about assumptions, the hands-on component, certainly when we've got our cloud labs online, that's definitive. But for now, I guess I would assume that you followed along in the courses with the instructor's demos. So you've got that hands-on component. Definitely you've got those covered then, but still there's the remaining piece of the practice exam. And if the CyberVista products that we include at Pluralsight cover your exam, then bully, then it looks like you're just about ready to go. Do some exam drilling and get into the mindset of answering these questions the way that Microsoft is going to test you, and you're golden.
Could you let us know the name of the tool that you use to draw again?
Oh yeah. This drawing tool that I like a whole lot is called Epic Pen. I need to form an affiliate partnership with them.
Yeah, you use it an awful lot.
I do. I mean, on one hand, I feel bad for my students because I'm drawing. First of all, just an aside trivia, I'm a lefty for the most part, but I use my right hand with my mouse. So any drawing I do with Epic Pen is with my non-dominant hand. So out of the gate, you're not going to get much clarity. But I hope it's helpful. If for no other reason, it might be superior to watching the mouse pointer. That's not a good experience when the instructor is waving the mouse pointer across. You're either going to fall into a hypnotic trance or rage quit the training or something.
Yeah, it definitely helps with the call outs and being able to draw attention instead of being like, where is that little tiny white
Yeah,
cursor?
exactly.
Yeah. Okay, last one. My company uses Cloudflare as cloud partner. I'm a developer and want to add value in the area of DevOps. How will Azure DevOps certification or ecosystem help me?
Okay, I'm thinking back to when I passed the AZ400, what I felt much better about. Well, I mean, you're going to, by definition, have much more comfortability in a DevOps ecosystem. The exam's not going to touch Agile or Scrum or any of the project management stuff. Really, to be perfectly candid with you, the AZ400 as it stands right now is basically a product exam. It tests that you understand how to use Azure DevOps. It's not going to ask you about DevOps methodology as such. But coming out of that skill set after doing that preparation and taking the exam, you're certainly going to be comfortable with source code control. You're going to understand some major security factors that go into that, code integrity. The concept of build and release pipelines takes you again into security, secrets management, it takes you into infrastructure. There's a reason why the Azure DevOps engineer is considered to be an advanced level cert as opposed to a fundamentals or an associate, because it does bring in quite a bit of administrator, developer, security. It really sprinkles in, to use that metaphor, quite a few skills from the other Azure job roles. And I hope that, just like you said, it's going to put you in a much better bargaining position for your next role or advancing in your current role.
Thank you everyone for joining us for session 4. We hope to see you next week, next Wednesday. And Tim, thanks for teaching us.
Sure thing, anytime. Thanks, Alyssa. Thanks, everyone. See you next week.